Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garret.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 434th episode, we have a bunch of news, including dinosaur claws and dinosaur play, or so Sabrina tells me, because she is doing all of the news.
Oh, lucky me.
I don't remember you ever doing all of the news before. It's very weird.
I think it's happened once or twice, but it is rare.
So I guess I'm going to learn a lot about what's going on in the news.
Yeah. Well, you're going to tell me about satellites.
I am. That's our Dinosaur Connection Challenge. And we have Dinosaur of the Day, Struthiosaurus. And of course, a fun fact, which is about comets and how they relate to dinosaurs.
Is it because you were looking up stuff about satellites and then comets are a natural extension when it comes to dinosaurs?
Exactly, yes. But before we get into all of that, we want to thank some of our patrons. And this week, we'd like to thank Porter Venator or Porter Venator. I asked if they had a preference, and they said they don't have a preference about Venator or Venator. So maybe it'll change from week to week. We'll see. We also have two other new patrons, Adam and Keith. Thank you both very much, or all three of you very much for joining. And then rounding out our shout outs, we have the Howard family, Ankylosaurus, Paulacanthus, Othnelia, Kelly, T-Bear, and Gabrielle.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a dino-it-all. Jumping into the news, because I've got all the news this week. Haha.
It's weird. It's really weird.
Well, speaking of weird, my first news item is about how Alvarezsaurs and Therizinosaurs are so weird.
That's literally the news item, that they're weird?
Well, their claws are weird. Kind of the big takeaway, well, one of the big takeaways from this paper is the giant claws of Therizinosaurus may have been useless.
Oh, I find that hard to believe. They're so huge.
I know.
If at the very least, they seem like they would have been useful for like showing off.
Well, yeah, there is that. So this was published in Communications Biology by Zhichuan Qin and others, and it's open access if you want to read all about they call it Most Bizarre Theropod Manual Unguals.
Yeah, that's true, because Alvarezsaurs and Therizinosaurs are very different, since Alvarezsaurs are those little tiny, super small claws. Or I guess the claws are kind of big, but on like basically non-existent arms in the chest.
Right.
Whereas Therizinosaurs are the exact opposite. They got huge arms and then massive claws on those big arms.
Yep. What were they doing?
Seems weird to combine them into one study because they're so different.
So there's a couple of good lines from the paper saying, quote, early branching Maniraptorans had extraordinary claws of mysterious function, which, yeah, I think that's basically what you just said.
Yep.
What was going on with these claws? And, quote, moreover, Alvarezsauroids and Therizinosaurians are closely related, but both lineages bear highly specialized unguals in derived members, yet ungual specialization evolved in opposite directions through time, end quote. So they're closely related, these weird dinosaurs, but the later members of the groups had even more specialized arms and claws, but these groups evolved it separately and in very different ways.
Yeah, closely related is, I don't know, they're sort of closely related. Like you said, they're Maniraptorans.
Yeah, right. But they're not on
not
the opposite
that distant.
ends. Yeah.
They're closely related like us and, I don't know, maybe a gorilla? Actually, we're probably closer related. I'm not sure where the comparison is, but it's not like, it's not like us and another hominid.
I do like thinking of them together, though, because they're both so, like, different.
Yes.
So, like you mentioned, Garret, Alvarezsaurs, they're small. They had the short arms and the stout single finger. It's kind of how we think of them. And then the Therizinosaurs are large, and they had these long fingers with sickle-like claws that were sometimes over 3 feet or 1 meter long.
Yeah. Nuts. The largest claws of any animal that has ever lived on Earth, period.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Can you imagine if some of that keratin broke off? Would that hurt? Like when you break a nail?
Oof, yeah.
So the authors of this paper, they developed a framework to see what these claws were for and how they formed. And they wanted to look at the hands and claws to figure out ecological niches. And they looked at how well the claws could handle the stress of 3 types of functions. Scratch digging, like you're scratch digging dirt and termite nests kind of thing. Hook and pull for grasping branches and vegetation or maybe even prey. And piercing.
Also known as stabbing.
Yeah.
Which is what you usually think of when you think of claws. Stabby, stab, stab.
Why not slash?
I guess slashy, slash. I guess that's hook and pull, kind of.
Yeah.
They don't have slashing on the list, I suppose.
No.
It's kind of like scratch digging. That's just like slashing, but at the ground.
I guess, yeah.
Since we don't think these were like hyper predators, that's probably why they didn't include it.
Yeah. So they applied the framework to 19 taxa, 19 different animals, and that includes 7 species of Alvarezsaurs and 6 species of Therizinosaurs that range from when they lived from the late Jurassic to the late Cretaceous. So then you can kind of see how things changed over time. And that includes Therizinosaurus, Mononychus, Linhonicus, Erliansaurus, Nothronicus, Beipiausaurus, Alxosaurus, Banicus, Falcarius, Haplochirus, Shishugonicus, and Arun.
I don't know those last 2.
I didn't either. That's why I like reading these papers. Well, one of the reasons also, like, what was up with the claws? Tell me. They also included 4 mammals, including one that was recently extinct, and the rest are living mammals. And with the mammals, we know what they used those forelimbs for, so you can compare them to dinosaurs. For example, pumas are hunters and climbers, but the authors also included Tamadua, which is the climbing anteater. And they also included Guanlong and Allosaurus, 2 non-maniraptorans, for more comparison.
It makes sense that they included an anteater, since we basically think that's probably what Alvarezsaurus did. I don't know about the others, though. I guess if Therizinosaurus was climbing some trees with its huge claws, maybe it was like a puma. I don't know.
Maybe. Well, the most surprising find, like I said, was that Therizinosaurus couldn't really do anything with its claws. Quote, it faced a risk of structural failure, end quote. So out of all of the animals they studied, these claws had the worst performance. They couldn't bear much stress.
Oh.
They said, quote, the extremely enlarged, narrowed, and functionally generally useless unguals of Therizinosaurus might have overgrown in proportion to the already very large body size, just as the huge antlers of Megaloceros giganteus or some overly complicated frills in late ceratopsians may have enlarged far beyond functional requirements, end quote. So going back to what you were saying, Garrett, that means, yeah, maybe the claws were just decorative and it could be used for threatening some enemies or attracting mates, kind of thing.
Yeah, that does happen all the time. That happens with feathers on birds too, where, they start out and they're a good display structure. They're a little helpful for flying. And then in some cases, they get so big because they're showy and nice.
Yeah.
But they end up being a little bit of a hindrance to their day-to-day activities. But it's worth it because the number one goal for most animals is reproducing.
Yeah.
So you need them.
It is disappointing, though, thinking like, oh, that's all they used it for was for show.
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's all they used it for was for show, because it was like we were talking about ankylosaurs clubs at one point, and they were basically saying, well, up to a certain size, they were probably really functional and helpful for defense. But then we see them get bigger, and the bigger tails don't seem to coincide with bigger, stronger ankylosaurs necessarily, or bigger, more threatening predators. So there might be like they grew beyond what was functionally required, but then it's sort of like a form and function. So like you might buy a car that is bigger than you actually need, but it looks cooler in that shape. So it's still functional, but it's like not all of its size is functional.
I think it's a little different with the Therizinosaurus claws, because if the framework they're using is correct, then it can't really bear any stress. So what can it do?
Yeah. I will point out, though, we don't know how sharp they were. And if you imagine it had, like you said, scythe-like, a scythe doesn't need to bear that much stress, right?
Yeah.
Because they're just slicing through wheat. It's just super sharp and it cuts right through whatever it's dealing with. So if it was slicing through things, be that things attacking it or be it leaves or something, then it doesn't need to bear a lot of stress.
Interesting.
Yeah, if you have meter-long razors on your hands.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need...
Now I'm thinking of Edward Scissorhands.
Exactly. Edward Scissorhands didn't need his scissor hands to bear a lot of stress. That's not what he was doing with them. They were still functional.
Well, maybe this framework is like a good start to studying these claws and what they're for.
Yeah.
Now, for therizinosaurs in general, they found that, quote, therizinosaurians are always regarded as the most bizarre theropod dinosaurs, end quote, which is probably true.
Dinocyrus is a little more bizarre, but I'll give them second most bizarre.
Well, you got Dinocyrus versus a whole group, therizinosaurs.
Yeah, true.
Now, they found that therizinosaurs couldn't really scratch dig.
Yeah. Digging with those claws would make no sense. It's exact wrong shape in every way.
It would be funny.
Yeah.
Now, early therizinosaurs, including Alvarezsaurs, Erliansaurus, and Falcarius, could have done well piercing and pulling, so maybe they grasped and pulled at vegetation, branches, or even prey. But later therizinosaurs, as they got bigger in size, had less functional unguals, arms or claws, because they couldn't handle as much stress.
I still think the function of having like massive, intimidating looking claws is a pretty good function in and of itself.
Yeah, if it can scare off some predators.
Yeah, way better than actually getting in a fight and having like little claws that are very strong is having huge, just insanely huge claws where something looks at you and is just like, nope, and walks away.
That's a good point. So yeah, there is form in being decorative. Or
there's function in the form.
Yeah, there we go. Now for Alvarezsaurs, they said, quote, the situation is more complicated, end quote. Alvarezsaurs, they got smaller over time, and so did their claws, but the size of the claws didn't affect how useful they were. The ratio of depth to width of them mattered more. Early Alvarezsauroids couldn't really scratch dig that well, but they could grasp and pierce. And then later Alvarezsauroids with the very short arms had some advantages, like allowing them to use more force in their arms and claws so they can bear lots of stress. And later Alvarezsaurs could efficiently dig.
So they're going the exact opposite routes. Both of the groups, and I guess their common ancestor, good at the grabbing and pulling, puncture and pull, potentially sort of mechanism. But the later ones of the therizinosaurs got weaker, and the later ones of the Alvarezsaurs got stronger. Yeah.
It went from a more general use for these claws to different specializations. And like later Cretaceous Alvarezsauroids like Linhanaicus may have been a specialized digger. It may have gone for insects and termites because it could dig for them.
And then you need some serious digging force, because that's even harder than going through hard dirt, going through a termite nest, which is like trying to dig through concrete.
Yeah. So there you have it. The weird therizinosaurs and Alvarezsaurs.
Yeah.
And a little more insight into their claws.
It is. It's interesting, too, because it sort of confirms what a lot of people have said about Alvarezsaurs, in that they were probably basically like dinosaur anteaters with these short arms and big claws that were basically, the shorter thing was an advantage for getting better force multipliers on the pulling strength, because you don't have a long limb that makes it harder to grab and dig. A lot of things that dig have shorter limbs. And also big, like robust claws that Alvarezsaurus seem to have. But it is very interesting. I hadn't ever heard before that Therizinosaurus actually kind of had weak claws.
Yeah, I hadn't either. Yeah, because I always think, oh, they're so big, they must be able to do some damage to something.
Yeah. Virtually every cartoon that has ever had, or comic that has had a Therizinosaurus in it, it's using its claws to just stab and slash and just tear things apart, maybe break through walls or whatever. And that doesn't seem like it would be the case, I guess.
Not being able to bear much stress, which makes me think of breaking nails.
Ugh, yeah, it does sound that way.
Well, I hope their future studies build on this, because I love these groups of dinosaurs.
It'd be great if we could figure out how sharp they were.
Yeah.
Just in general, what the keratin covering, because we just have the bone. The bone alone is almost a meter long. And then the keratin sheath could extend way beyond that, so they could be truly massive.
Definitely.
Potentially very pointy and or sharp along that front edge.
Okay, moving on. I guess this next one has a little bit to do with claws, but kind of has to do with everything because it's about dinosaurs playing. Like, did dinosaurs play? And if so, how did they play? Which is a really fun question.
That's quite a thing to try to answer.
Yes.
That seems like something I would try to figure out for a fun fact and then give up.
Well, the way to do it, or at least for this paper, is that they studied birds to figure out how dinosaurs may have played.
Mm-hmm.
And this was published in International Journal of Play.
Huh.
Yeah, I didn't know that was a journal.
Pretty sure that's the first time in 400 plus episodes we've mentioned that journal.
It was published by Claudia Zeitrag and others. And this article is also open access if you want to read more about birds playing. The authors started by saying that descriptions on how play evolved, quote, are surprisingly patchy, end quote. And, that makes sense because it'd be really hard to figure out how play started. I'm not an expert on play.
Yeah, we're going to have to read more of this journal.
The authors did say that it was important to study how some key animals play, and then you can compare them to other animals. And you want to correlate the results with socioecology, brain anatomy, and other factors. So to understand the evolution of play in dinosaurs, they turned to paleognaths. And they said this one's an essential taxon because they have many ancestral features from the non-avian dinosaurs, quote, making them an ideal window into the behaviors of the earliest birds, end quote. The brain sizes of theropods and early birds, including paleognaths, are similar, and there's some evidence of dinosaur parental care, which is also similar to paleognaths, like incubating eggs on nests and taking care of the young. So for this study, they observed how greater rheas play. And greater rheas are flightless birds. They look similar to emus. They live in Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay in open areas like grasslands or grassy wetlands, and they weigh between 44 to 60 pounds or 20 to 27 kilograms.
Yeah, it's not that heavy.
No. Maybe it's easier to play. I don't know. They tend to be gray or brown, and then they have fairly small heads. They recorded captive rheas playing. There were 2 adult males, 2 adult females, and 7 parent-raised juveniles. It was at a zoo in Sweden. The juveniles were 6 weeks old when they started recording, and they recorded for about a month and a half.
I mean, now that we have a kid, thinking of 6-week-olds playing,
yeah,
a 6-week-old human
can't play.
Can't do anything.
They can eat and they can sleep.
They can open their eyes for about 4 hours a day, I feel like. Look at you, maybe.
That's their play.
That's the interaction you get with them.
Yes. Anyway, as you might imagine, it's hard to define what play is because sometimes what looks like playing is actually a serious behavior.
So you're saying maybe babies, when they're just looking at you, are playing?
Well, I wasn't thinking of humans. For this study, they defined 5 criteria for what is play. It's something that doesn't matter for survival.
Mm-hmm.
It must be voluntary, rewarding, and fun. It must be different from things that are functional. It must be repeated as the animal grows up, during ontogeny. And it must be initiated when they're not under physical or mental stress.
That's a good definition of play.
Yeah.
Although, as someone who was once a teenage boy, being voluntary, rewarding, and fun might be tested from time to time. There's a lot of play that is not particularly fun, rewarding, and not always voluntary by all participants.
I see.
I feel like there's entire YouTube channels dedicated to that type of play.
Well, I'll point out again, for this study, they had some adults and then juveniles, not subadults, not close to teenage.
I think even some juveniles of some animal groups, they're not all having fun all the time when they're playing, because there is a lot of play fighting. We've talked about play fighting isn't necessarily, I guess it's rewarding in a way because it sort of is practice.
Or is that considered actually serious behavior?
It could be, depending on what the results are and who's fighting.
So they talked about 3 types of play here. There's locomotor, and examples of that are running, leaping, and prancing. Then there's object, and examples of that are mouthing, pawing, pushing, or pecking. Then there's social. such as chasing, play fighting, and nipping. And social play is often in a safe space where juveniles can practice these behaviors.
They do have play fighting.
That's true. Now, play can be done alone or with others, and when with others, it's considered contagious, meaning at least one other individual starts to play during or within 3 seconds of play starting. Again, this is for the greater RIAs.
That makes sense. Actually, now that you mention it, because it is voluntary play fighting for the most part, because you could always just run away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't have to partake.
Usually. I sound like I was abused as a child.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you had a lot of fun playtime.
Yeah, my sisters and I fought a lot.
Well, back to the birds. They found that all the play with the greater RIAs happened spontaneously. The play didn't last long. On average, it was only about 10 seconds. And a little more than half of the time, the play was contagious, meaning they got others to join. Juveniles played more than adults, which doesn't really surprise me. Mostly they did the locomotive play, where they play running and leaping. And that could be to practice their flight response to predators.
Mm-hmm.
Play running is when they ran without any destination in mind, often in circles.
Circles.
Yeah, circles for 10 seconds. That'd be fun to watch.
That's hilarious.
Adults and juveniles both play ran, often while swinging their necks. They have this snake-like movement of the neck, and they're flapping their wings.
That's so weird. I figured they were just play running the way every kid does, where it's like you want to race and then you run towards something.
I imagine like a noodly neck flapping while they're going in a circle.
That's ridiculous.
The juveniles also did a lot of leaping and jumping straight up and throwing their necks from side to side. And play running was contagious, so one of them would start running in circles and another one would join.
That almost sounds more like dancing than running.
Now, around the age of 10 and a half weeks, the juveniles had interactive social play, and social play could help with social competence. So only the juveniles did this, and it was things like chasing or bumping into each other while play running, pecking at each other's necks, which was sometimes reciprocated, and wrestling, where they lay next to each other on the ground with their necks intertwined while pecking each other on the neck and pushing against each other to try to get the other to roll onto its side.
It's funny wrestling when your main things are long legs and a big noodly neck and you don't have any hands.
That's just because we're used to how humans wrestle.
I feel like most animals would consider that a weird way to wrestle.
It's hard to know.
Intertwining necks. It's not a common feature that animals can do.
Yeah. Reptiles also play, but there's not that many studies about it, and they tend to object play. Like Komodo dragons sometimes play tug-of-war with zookeepers, and they play differently from paleognaths. So the author said it, quote, appears that play has evolved independently several times in different clades, end quote. Now, since there's evidence that crocodilians and birds play, and they're both archosaurs, like dinosaurs, that means it's really likely that non-avian dinosaurs played too. As the authors put it, we can, quote, unproblematically assume, end quote, that they played. So maybe paravians / dromaeosaurs played similarly to paleognaths, and, they had some social components. I think it's really fun to think about dinosaurs running in circles for fun.
Yeah, or playing tug-of-war. That's kind of fun, too.
Oh, yeah, tug-of-war. But I was thinking specifically the necks.
Yeah, the weird movements. You could definitely imagine it for some of the rhea and ostrich-looking ones, like a Struthiomimus or a Gallimimus or something.
Yeah.
Might have done the exact same thing.
Yeah. So I think they're planning on doing future research on more species. I hope so, because this is a really fun topic.
That is, yeah. You could probably, from a phylogenetic bracketing perspective, using the closest relatives, all we can work from is basically birds and reptiles, or crocodilians specifically. Mm-hmm. But if you look at maybe similar animal body types, you might be able to guess at other things too. Because that neck intertwining thing is more about what kind of neck they have than anything else. Mm-hmm. So maybe, I wonder if you could say maybe something like a giraffe might be an analog for a sauropod, or something.
Maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know. It is fun to think about.
Mm-hmm. And in just a moment, we'll get on to one more article about claws, this time raptor claws. But first, we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break.
And my last news item, we're going back to claws. And this is about how raptors probably use their killing claws to pin their prey rather than slash.
Again, it's a did they poke or did they slash question.
Yeah. This was published by Taylor Oswald and others in Bio1 Complete. And it's another study where we're looking at birds and trying to figure out from bird behavior how that applies to the non-avian dinosaurs.
Makes sense.
So for this study, they observed the red-legged Therizinosaurus at the Wildlife World Zoo, Aquarium, and Safari Park in Phoenix, Arizona, and the Tracy Aviary and Botanical Gardens in Salt Lake City, Utah, both in the U.S.
It is a very popular bird to use when comparing to raptors.
Yeah, they're very raptor-like. I mean, they're birds that are predatory and territorial.
And they have the claws.
Yes.
And they're flightless, I think, or at least mostly flightless.
I'm not sure about that. But yeah, the prominent recurved sickle claws, where they hold them off the ground, they're similar to Dinosaurs. And it could be that it convergently evolved its claws because it had a similar lifestyle and feeding habits. And yeah, that means that you can compare how Therizinosaurus use their claws to how Dinosaurs use their claws. Therizinosaurus, the red-legged Therizinosaurus, they're about 30 to 35 inches or 75 to 90 centimeters long, and they weigh about 3.3 to 4.9 pounds or 1.5 to 2.2 kilograms. They also have long necks, tails, and legs, and grayish-brown feathers. They're white on the belly, and they have a reddish beak. They mostly live in Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Argentina, and they prefer to live in grasslands. They're also mostly carnivorous, but I think it's technically they're omnivorous because they eat grasshoppers, lizards, rodents, and other small vertebrates, as well as fruit, grains, and probably eggs.
Yeah, I remember I was reading about them for our first I Know Paleo episode.
And our bonus.
Yeah, I ran into the same thing, which was basically they're mostly carnivorous, but they do occasionally eat plants, which is funny because oftentimes we're talking about the opposite, where things are like there's no true herbivore because most things will eat the occasional bug or whatever. But this one is like it's not quite a true carnivore.
So going back to the way Therizinosaurus use their claws and comparing it to dinosaurs is they found that the way these birds use their claws is similar to the raptor prey restraint or RPR hypothesis, where they use the claws to pin and grasp their prey instead of slash. They use their claw to pin objects and prey, and then they tear what they're holding with their beaks, which sounds a little bit gory.
It sounds a lot like the Hatcher and Nations T-Rex display at the American Museum of Natural History, because I feel like the T-Rex has a foot on the Triceratops, if I'm remembering right, and then it's sort of grabbing the frill with its mouth and like pulling at its head.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of strategy, except in this case...
It's got the big claw.
Yeah, it's not
foot.
just the weight. I mean, the T-Rex, it weighs, like 8 tons.
Sure.
It doesn't need to stab it with a claw. It can just stand on it, and that's enough. But you could imagine for a velociraptor, which is just tens of pounds, or the Therizinosaurus, which you said is, less than 10 pounds, only like 5 pounds, that having something you could stab into with would be really useful for sort of holding struggling prey.
Yeah, for those lizards and rodents and grasshoppers.
Yeah, because like a mouse, if you put just like 3 pounds on a mouse, it's going to be able to slip away. But if you poke a claw on it, not so much.
Yes. We've got claws and play this week.
Yep. And we also have satellites.
It's very different.
We're still going through our answers to our survey, and I know the Dinosaur Connection Challenge was polarizing. Some people really like it, some people don't like it as much, but I think our main takeaway was that we need to make it more dinosaur-centric, because sometimes we were really going off into the weeds, not so much into dinosaurs, so that's what we're going to try to do more of in the future. So I've got a lot of different ways to connect dinosaurs to satellites, and it's a pretty dinosaur-focused method that I'm going for.
All right.
And thanks to Rich for suggesting dinosaurs connected to satellites, or for challenging us, maybe I should say. So first, I feel like I need to define a satellite because it's weird. So in astronomy, a satellite can be any object orbiting another.
Oh, so it doesn't have to be a man-made object.
It does not. So that means that non-avian dinosaurs were technically killed by a satellite.
Oh, that's a quick connection.
It is. The Chicxulub impactor itself was a satellite until it hit Earth. And then it was no longer a satellite because it's not, or maybe it's still sort of a satellite in a way because the Earth is like a satellite of the sun. Maybe. I don't know. That's getting too.
But it wasn't really orbiting Earth.
No, it was orbiting the sun, but it's still orbiting the sun, just now connected to Earth.
Oh, okay.
After it hit. But that seems kind of silly because it's not its own body anymore. It's just part of Earth. If you Google Chicxulub on a computer, by the way, a meteor goes across the screen, and when it reaches the bottom of the screen, the text shakes.
It's a fun little Easter egg.
Yeah, I was very surprised. I Googled it, and I was like, what is happening? There's a thing going across the screen. It didn't work on a phone. It only worked when I did it on a computer. But it worked on Firefox, so it's not just like a Chrome thing. Every meteor shower, this means, though, that both we see and what dinosaurs see were caused by burning satellites. So that's another connection to dinosaurs saw satellites.
Yeah.
Because they could see burning debris coming up in the atmosphere just like we can. But in common English, a satellite usually means a machine orbiting the Earth. And I think that's probably what the intent of this dinosaur connection challenge is.
That's usually what I think most people think of.
Yeah, it's that's the primary definition for, at least for common non-astronomers. So one interesting thing would be if any dinosaurs were big enough that they could be seen from a satellite with the naked eye.
If any dinosaurs were big enough?
Yeah, because there's always those little fun facts about things that could be seen.
Oh, like the Great Wall.
It turns out, funny you should mention the Great Wall, that is one of the most commonly cited things that you can supposedly see with the naked eye.
Oh, you can't actually?
You definitely can't. Not even close. So the Great Wall is only about 4 to 5 meters wide, which is about 13 to 16 feet wide. And that's just way too narrow to see with the naked eye from space.
Interesting.
It's not too surprising when you think about it because crewed satellites orbit at about 300 to 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, or about 200 to 250 miles.
Crewed is in there are people there?
Yeah, people that could look at it with the naked eye.
Crewed like crude oil at first.
Oh, no. CREWED. Which it is kind of crazy. That seems very close, like 250 miles, because you can drive farther than that in a day pretty easily.
Yeah.
And that's about the distance you have to go up to get to one of these satellites. Pretty interesting. But from another perspective, 250 miles is a very long distance to try to look and see something. And something that's 15 feet wide is you're not going to be able to see from 250 miles away. You can't see it on a horizon that's less than a tenth that. So anyway.
Good point.
Despite the popular legend, the Great Wall of China is not visible from space without magnification. You can see it with a camera, obviously.
You can see anything with enough magnification.
Pretty much. Interestingly, there are quite a few man-made objects you can see from space. Lots of really big things like quarries and things like that, but also some wide freeways in high contrast spots or with lights can be seen pretty easily from space. But getting to if you could see a dinosaur from space on one of these satellites, since the Great Wall is about 4 to 5 meters wide or 13 to 16 feet, I was like, well, what is the widest sauropod? Because you'd want something that's fairly long too.
Something big all around.
Yes. Patagotitan's pretty big. We know it's like 120 feet long. It's pretty bulky in the chest too. And it looks like it was maybe about 3 to 4 meters or 10 to 13 feet in diameter, sort of estimating on the larger potential size, which is still narrower than the Great Wall. And it's so much shorter. I mean, the Great Wall is like thousands of miles long, whereas Patagotitan's like, 100 or so feet. So unfortunately, I don't think you'd be able to see any dinosaurs from space with the naked eye, basically under any circumstances.
That's a bummer.
Yeah. But some dinosaurs may have literally become satellites of Earth. This is in the non-mechanical realm.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, I think some fossils have been sent to space.
Yes. I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But of the dinosaurs that could have become satellites of Earth, basically any dinosaurs near the impact site of the Chicxulub impactor would have been vaporized, and some of their material would have been launched up into the air, likely into orbit.
Mm-hmm.
No dinosaurs would have been launched like full-bodied into space like a trampoline or something like that. But little pieces of them probably would be.
Yeah.
Because you talked about not too long ago that there are technically pieces of that impact event that have been found on the moon.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, why not pieces of dinosaur?
Yeah, and that was in our tiny little sampling, right? And there were a bunch of pieces from the Chicxulub impactor, and a lot of the biomass at the end of the Cretaceous was dinosaur. So yeah, there were definitely, if you look at the statistics of it, there were definitely chunks of dinosaurs that ended up orbiting.
That would be an interesting study.
To try to figure out how much dinosaur is orbiting Earth as satellites. I was going to look into like how long does it stay up there, but the orbital decay rates depend on how high they are and stuff. But you could just say that they are still orbiting the Earth because some of it's sitting on the moon. So yeah, and the moon is a satellite of the Earth. But back to the mechanical satellites. Living dinosaurs have been on satellites. And in fact, dozens of living dinosaurs have been in space on mechanical satellites.
Well, then you must mean birds.
I do. This is sort of a cop-out. There's always like a bird version of the Dinosaur Connection Challenge. But this one was actually really interesting, so I thought it was worth talking about.
They're all interesting. That's how we end up talking about them.
This one's really cool, though.
Okay.
So the first bird in space was a Japanese quail.
All right.
In 1979, the USSR launched fertilized Japanese quail eggs in an incubator into space to see the effects of zero gravity on their development.
So they hatched in space? Maybe.
Well, eventually, yes.
Okay.
But I know you love quail eggs, so I thought you might appreciate this. According to the Audubon Society, the goal was to see if they would hatch and could be used as future food for cosmonauts.
Oh, yeah.
Which... if you've ever looked into being a vegetarian or a vegan, you immediately know this doesn't make any sense because then you have to bring the bird food up with you, and you're always better off just bringing up the food you're going to eat because it's so much less efficient to like feed an animal and then eat the animal. You just grow the quail on Earth and then send them up with the astronauts. It doesn't, I mean, maybe in like a distant future where you have like a colony in space and you need a certain amount of protein, but even then it's like grow some plant. Anyway.
But what if you want some meat?
I guess, yeah. That 1979 experiment went really poorly. None of them hatched, and they suffered from delayed growth and deformities.
Oh.
It was possibly due to extra radiation and or temperatures at higher levels than they would have wanted. And so, yeah, none of them hatched. However, in 1990, they successfully hatched a quail on Mir and later hatched 5 more, making it an even half dozen. And they call them Cosmo quails, which is wonderful.
Space quails.
I love Cosmo quail. You could also call them like a quailstronaut or something. I mean, Cosmo quail is obviously what you do because they were Russian. But if they were American, I think you'd call them an astro quail.
Oh, okay.
Because it's astronauts in the US and it's cosmonauts in Russia.
Oh, I see.
So there are 6 dinosaur astronauts / cosmonauts right there. There are videos of these chicks floating in zero gravity.
I'd say that must be weird for them, but it's also all they ever knew at that point.
Yeah. So I was very interested in looking at this video, and it is very weird for them. So that's what I thought too, though. It's like it's all they've known. Maybe they just take to it. They do not take to it. They are extremely agitated, and they definitely missed gravity. Like they're just like, basically, it looks like they're panicking. It's kind of sad.
No.
But they also didn't have any interest in mating. And they wouldn't eat either until they got anchored down with little harnesses so that they calmed down and then they would eat. But
that makes me sad.
Once they were bigger, they seemed a lot better because you can actually fly in space if you're a bird. So it seems weird to think about it. But the way flight works, I mean, we've talked a ton about it on this show, but it's about the air moving over the wind, and then you generate thrust by pushing wings through the air. And there's air in a satellite. They're not in space. If you're in space, you know, like outside of the satellite, flapping your wings isn't going to do anything. But inside the satellite, they could actually fly around, which is pretty cool. So like having wings in space in a satellite is actually really effective, like maybe even more effective than being on land. So I thought that was pretty cool. NASA followed up with a program of their own. They started it in 1986. The idea came from a middle schooler who came up with it after hatching eggs at home, and he learned that chicken eggs have to be turned so they develop properly, partly because gravity pulls the embryos to the bottom of the egg, and they can sort of get stuck to the eggshell. They're better off on top of the yolk, so if you turn them, then that doesn't end up happening. It actually ended up getting sponsored by KFC, which is super weird. It's such an American version of this after talking about the Russian version. The original set of eggs was on the 10th flight for the Challenger, but that was the flight that exploded shortly after liftoff, which means that in addition to the 7 humans who tragically lost their lives, a dozen dinosaur embryos were also destroyed. It's a weird bit of trivia that I had never seen before, and I couldn't even find reference to this in any of the Challenger stuff. I only saw a reference to it in like really specific references to these dinosaur or bird embryos.
I think the focus is on the people there.
Yeah. In 1990, they did try again with 32 new fertilized eggs on the space shuttle, this time on Discovery. It was nicknamed Chicks in Space. It's pretty funny. Half of them were laid 9 days before launch, and the other half were laid 2 days before launch because they wanted to compare different levels, different phases of their development. And, if they did better or worse, depending on how old the embryos were in space. They orbited for 5 days and then landed back down. None of them hatched in space. They weren't really expected to because 14 days is a little early for hatching. But the first did hatch just 1 day after landing. They nicknamed it Kentucky, probably because KFC.
Yeah.
And then 7 more hatched. All of them that hatched were from the batch that was laid 9 days before takeoff. So they assumed that spending days 3 to 8 of development in space was just too early and too much for the chicks to handle.
They're Earth animals.
They really are. Which is interesting because it's like the gravity can kill them if they don't get rotated, but having no gravity is also a problem.
But years of evolution.
Yep.
Gotten it just right for them.
Exactly. So all this means that I believe the 6 Cosmo quails from 1990 are not only the only dinosaurs ever born in space, but also the only vertebrates ever born in space.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And apparently it's unlikely to change anytime in the future because bringing live animals into space has a lot of restrictions now because it's just not great having, like all that debris and biological matter, and they take up a lot of space and they're sort of difficult to handle. So we're not expecting any similar experiment in the near future. There was also an earlier fun fact that you alluded to, which is that non-avian dinosaurs have been on 2 satellites.
Yeah, I think we've talked about those.
Yeah. This does not include the bits that may have been launched out of the atmosphere during the Chicxulub impact.
Sure, no one's done a study on that yet.
No. These are bits of non-avian dinosaurs that we brought to our own human-made mechanical satellites. So the first one was in 1985 when some Maiasaura bone fragments and eggshell fragments were taken up to Space Lab 2. And as far as I can tell, they weren't used in any actual experiments on the space station. It was just a publicity stunt. Prepping fossils in space would be a really horrible idea because all of that fine rock debris would just be such a nightmare for everybody around.
Yeah.
In 1998, a Coelophysis skull was brought along on a mission to Mir. So this time the Americans were quicker than the Russians. And again, this seemed to be just another publicity stunt, basically. So there you go. Those are all the connections I came up with between satellites and dinosaurs. I also have a connection between dinosaurs and another celestial body in our fun fact.
Like the cosmoquails and chicks in space.
Yeah. It is great. And just the fact that a bird can fly in a satellite is really interesting to me. They're not like super great at it because they are expecting gravity, but I think if they were up there long enough, they could probably get the hang of it and move around a lot more effectively than a human can, having to push off walls all the time.
Yeah.
And in just a moment, we'll get on to our dinosaur of the day, Struthiosaurus. But first, we're going to pause for one last sponsor break.
And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Struthiosaurus, which was a request from PaleoMike716 via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. It was a nodosaurid dinosaur that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Austria, Romania, France, Spain, and Hungary. Just real quick, not to be confused with the ornithomimid Struthiomimus, which was way more bird-like.
Yeah. I think I mentioned Struthiosaurus, or you mentioned Struthiosaurus in an earlier episode, and I said nothing could be farther from a ostrich-like.
Right, because the name Struthiosaurus means ostrich lizard.
Yeah, but it's an ankylosaur.
It has to do with the brain case. I'll get to that in a minute. So, it may be one of the most basal ankylosaurs. So, yeah, when you're thinking about how it looked, not really bird-like. It looked somewhat like other nodosaurids like Borealopelta. It walked on 4 legs. It had these large shoulder spikes. It had an elongate head. The body was covered in armor, but no tail club. And actually, yeah, you're right, Garrett. We did talk about it in episode 274. And when you, as you put it, when we talked about it, it was, quote, like a big tanky dog covered in armor and spikes.
Big tanky dog. That's a weird choice that I made.
Yep. It's in the archives.
I stand by it, I guess.
A Struthiosaurus may have been a dwarf dinosaur. It's estimated to be about 6.6 to 9.8 feet, or 2 to 3 meters long, and weighed about 660 pounds, or 330 kilograms. And at the time that Struthiosaurus lived, what is now Europe, where it lived, was mostly islands. In 2017, Norbert Frotzler, in a preprint paper, reconstructed Struthiosaurus austriacus. That's the type species. It was part of the 650th anniversary celebrations of the University of Vienna. This was back in 2015 when they celebrated. Oof. Yeah.
Stuff in Europe is so old compared to the US.
But also young compared to dinosaurs.
That's true. I think I remember why I called it a dog now, because you said it was basal. I think it's got longer legs than you see on later ankylosaurs, so it's got more of like a dog-like posture.
There you go. Just to add to your...
Doubling down.
Yep. Now, Frotzler was asked to prepare a diagram of Struthiosaurus and presented the reconstruction at the anniversary celebration, and then the paper was an explanation of that reconstruction. And he described Struthiosaurus as, quote, conspicuously small, end quote, with a long neck, and, quote, probably it was feeding mainly on ants and termites, at least when a juvenile animal, end quote. So kind of interesting to think about. The type species, as I mentioned, is Struthiosaurus austriacus. Edward Seuss, a geologist, found a dinosaur tooth back in 1859 at a coal mine in Austria on top of a stone pile. They tried to find more fossils, and eventually they found a thin marl layer with a lot of bones in a freshwater deposit. It's part of the what's now known as the Grunbach Formation. The fossils are stored at the Museum of the University of Vienna, and they weren't studied until 1870. Immanuel Bunzel studied the fossils and then named a few new dinosaurs, including Struthiosaurus, based on part of the skull and brain case, and he named Struthiosaurus in 1871. Like I mentioned, that genus name, Struthiosaurus, means ostrich lizard, and it refers to the bird-likeness of the brain case.
Yeah, you gotta name it based on what you find.
Yep.
And unfortunately...
He didn't know.
Sometimes that can be very misleading later on.
Yes. And the species name, Austriacus, refers to the provenance from Austria where the fossils were found. Bunzel also described other Struthiosaurus fossils in osteoderms, but he referred them to Scelidosaurus and Hylaeosaurus.
Some other good ankylosaurs.
Yeah. He also described rib fragments that he thought were from a giant lizard because they had these double-headed ribs, which means more joints between the ribs and vertebrae, and therefore the rib cage could be more mobile. And he named that Danubiasaurus anceps after the Danube River. And that name is a nod to Mosasaurus, which was named after the river Mose, which I didn't realize Mosasaurus was named after a river, but, you know, not a dinosaur, so.
Yeah. I like Danubisaurus.
Yes, well, all those bones turned out to be from Struthiosaurus.
Oh, no. So now we can't use Danubiasaurus.
I don't think so.
Maybe without the O. Maybe it can just be Danubesaurus.
Maybe.
This sounds cool.
Bunzel knew that the brain case was from a reptile, but the brain case was different from lizards and crocodiles. It was low, compact, and had a gradual curve to the skull roof. So he thought the brain case could be from a dinosaur, but he wasn't sure, and he thought it might be a bird based on how the bones are rounded and fused. So he sent a drawing and description to Thomas Huxley, who agreed that it was a bird.
Oh, that's delightful. Since Thomas Huxley was one of the early birds are dinosaurs guys.
Yeah.
And this is happening in the late 1800s when everyone's debating that.
Yep. And Bunzel wrote in his description of the fossils, quote, with time, it might also be possible to create and order ornithocephala, bird heads, end quote.
Ornithocephala. The bird-brained ones.
Yep. Now, in Bunzel's defense, it was hard to know that this was an ankylosaur brain case at the time because it was the first one described and there were only fragments, so the skull seemed to be lightly built. Bunzel didn't really have osteoderms either when he described the fossils.
Yeah, you got to work with what you got.
Yep. Now, Nopsha in 1902 found that it was an ankylosaur, and in 1978, Walter Coombs said that it was a nodosaurid. At least 3 individuals of different ages of Struthiosaurus were found in Austria, according to Superbiola and Galton in 2001. There used to be many species of Struthiosaurus based on fragmentary fossils and material that didn't have unique features, also known as non-diagnostic. And then there were also animals that later we found out were Struthiosaurus, and that includes Danubiasaurus, but also some other animals like Pleuropeltis and Hoplosaurus. In 1881, Seeley examined Bunzel's fossils and found many of the bones, plates, and teeth were part of one dinosaur, which he named Cretaceous, and that means mighty shoulder. Nopsha later synonymized Cretaceous with Struthiosaurus.
That's a cool meaning too, because those shoulders, they got those huge spikes sticking out of them.
That's true.
It's a solid name, but I guess also one that we're not going to be using.
Well, yeah, it turned out to be part of Struthiosaurus. So there are 3 valid species of Struthiosaurus today. There's Struthiosaurus austriacus, Struthiosaurus transylvanicus, which was named by Nopsha in 1915, and Struthiosaurus languedocensis, which was named in 2003 by Garcia and Paredes Superbiola. In 2003, when they described Struthiosaurus languedocensis, it was based on a partial skeleton of an adult that was found in southern France back in 1998. The species name refers to the region where the fossils were found. Struthiosaurus austriacus was smaller than Struthiosaurus transylvanicus, and it had shorter neck vertebrae, just talking a little bit about what makes these species different. Struthiosaurus languedocensis had flatter dorsal vertebrae and a different shaped ischium or pelvis. Now, you briefly mentioned Struthiosaurus in episode 400 when we talked about all the hot seg dinosaurs. However, there's been some debate on Struthiosaurus transylvanicus, and sometimes the Struthiosaurus is referred to in quotes. Nopsha, when he described it, included parts of the skull vertebrae, parts of the shoulder and armor. In 1997, Superbiola and Galton said that the Struthiosaurus transylvanicus may be valid, but the fossils are probably inadequate to show that it's different from Struthiosaurus austriacus. And there's been debate on even the type species because Coombs and Marianska considered Struthiosaurus austriacus to be a novum dubium. In 2013, Osai and Pranvai tentatively assigned a humerus, an arm bone, of an adult dinosaur. They knew that it was an adult based on histology that was found in Hungary to Struthiosaurus. And this find helped show that there were 2 nodosaurs that lived alongside each other in that area, which means that there was more diversity in European ankylosaurs than we previously thought.
Hooray!
Yeah, the other nodosaurid is Hungarosaurus, and that was almost twice the size of Struthiosaurus.
We saw that one in the museum in Hungary. That was a pretty cool one.
Yeah, and pretty large from what I remember.
Mm-hmm.
We've also talked about Struthiosaurus in episode 374 because there was a paper published last year by Marco Schad and others, and this is about the Struthiosaurus being, what were the headlines? It was like slow and couldn't really hear. Yeah,
deaf and slow moving or something like that, or uncoordinated.
Yeah. So in the paper for the study, they re-examined the holotype brain case of Struthiosaurus using micro CT scanning, just as a quick recap. And Struthiosaurus had relatively short semicircular canals in the inner ear. And large semicircular canals make animals better at balancing and more sensitive to head movements. Struthiosaurus also didn't have a floccular recess, and that helps you stabilize your vision when you're moving your head, and it's linked to motor control. And it had the shortest cochlear duct of any known dinosaur, which probably means it couldn't hear very well, maybe a little better than a turtle. The authors also found lots of blood cells around the brain, which helps show that it may have used extra blood vessels to cool down their brains. So, taken all together, it means Struthiosaurus probably spent a lot of its time alone, eating, and it wasn't very active.
It was just minding its own business.
It was. We've also talked about Struthiosaurus in episode 377. So I think we've talked about it, 3 other episodes?
Yeah, it comes up.
Yeah. When Garret, you pondered if it could rely on infrasound to hear.
The answer is no.
Yeah, because Struthiosaurus could hear down to about 300 hertz, which is around middle C on a piano.
Mm-hmm.
And under 20 hertz is considered infrasound. So yeah, no, Struthiosaurus couldn't do it. But as you mentioned, elephants and blue whales can.
They got much better ears.
Yep. So there we go. Struthiosaurus, the name means ostrich, but it's really nothing like an ostrich.
Yeah, it's too bad we didn't get that name that meant like impressive shoulder.
Yeah.
It was so fitting for a nodosaur. Instead we got bird lizard or ostrich lizard, which it just isn't.
Well, that's what happens when it's one of the earlier fossils found and there's only fragments.
Yeah, that's true. And our fun fact of the day is that dinosaurs never saw Halley's Comet.
Yep, not that satellite.
Nope. There are 3 possible pronunciations of Halley's Comet. They rhyme with daily, valley, or crawley.
Oh.
So it could be Halley, Halley, or
Halley.
And Halley seems like a weird one, but apparently that might be the most likely answer, which is funny because most pedantic people are like, oh, it's Halley's Comet, not Halley's Comet. It's like, well, it could be Halley's Comet.
What was it named a long time ago and we don't really know how it was supposed to be pronounced?
So the guy who it's named after was a friend of Isaac Newton's.
Okay.
So yeah, it's been a while and pronunciation changes over time. So This is, our usual PSA of don't worry about pronunciation. It's fine. As long as people know what you're talking about. Don't give people a hard time. Anyway, the reason I'm pretty confident dinosaurs never saw Halley's Comet is because even though it's one of the most famous comets visible with the naked eye, so that means they could have seen it with the naked eye if it was around, and it's been observed and documented by humans every 74 to 79 years since 240 BCE, we don't think it's been around since the Mesozoic.
Oh, okay.
And it's named Halley's Comet because Halley was a friend of Newton's, and he built on Newton's work understanding gravity to figure out that all of those 74 to 79 year occurrences going back to 240 BCE were the same comet. So it's pretty clever historical digging that he was doing.
So how far back does it go?
We don't know exactly. I spent a lot of time trying to find if there was anybody who had a really solid guess of how long it's been orbiting. But I guess it's one of those things where there just isn't evidence. Like you can't figure it out really. Exactly. It doesn't leave sort of traces that we know how to track the age of or anything like that, because the literal age of the comet is like the age of the solar system, just like all the rocks and everything in the solar system. So that doesn't help. The real question is how long it's been in its current orbit. And without people there to observe it, it's really hard to know. Our best guess is that it's been in its current orbit for up to about 200,000 years. So that's what I'm going with. That was what one paper was estimating. And 200,000 years obviously doesn't get you anywhere near the Mesozoic.
Right.
But its orbit changes all the time, not only because it's highly elliptical orbit, it has a highly elliptical orbit. And so if it comes near to a planet, then it can get thrown off. But also, as it passes the sun, it off-gasses a bunch, and that works like a little rocket, sort of changing its direction, spewing and sublimating ice off. It does get really close to the sun, too. At its closest to the sun, it's closer to the sun than any planet other than Mercury. So it goes inside Venus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What do you mean it goes inside Venus's orbit?
Yes.
Yeah.
And at its farthest from the sun, it's about as far out as Pluto.
Wow.
So yeah, it goes out there.
Yeah. It knows our solar system.
Yeah. Although when it's near Pluto or near Pluto's distance, it's nowhere near Pluto itself because it's at a pretty far angle off from our solar system. So if you imagine like our solar system is like a tabletop, if you put, say, like a plate on it and then lift up one side of it, that edge that's touching the table is when it's near the sun and near Earth, basically. So it's pretty close to us.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's out by Pluto, it's way far away because it's so far. That angle really gets magnified the farther out you get from the sun. The off-gassing might be the bigger impact on why it changes its direction. It's what makes it so hard to predict where it's going to be in the future. If it was only the gravity of planets, we could predict it pretty well because we know how the planets move. We know how Halley's Comet is moving. So we could do a model and see what planets it's going to be close to and how the gravity is going to pull them in different directions. But the off-gassing works like a little rocket, and then it also creates that big pretty tail and coma around it, which is what we want to see. But it also makes changing forces occur on it, and I think it can vary even depending on sort of the intensity of the sun and solar winds and stuff like this. So it makes the modeling really, really complicated and difficult to measure. So we basically can only guess for about 2 or 3 future orbits and where it's going to be. The longest estimate I found for how long Halley's Comet will keep orbiting is 10 million years, but other analyses estimate it will break in half in under 100,000 years. And if it doesn't break into pieces, there are people saying that it'll get ejected from the solar system in around that time period. But even if it doesn't get ejected, it'll be much smaller, and I don't even know how much longer it'll be visible because the estimates are that it has already lost 80 to 90% of its size in the last couple thousand passes by the sun, or a couple 100,000 years. I can't imagine one that's like 10 times as big and bright. That must have been a sight to behold, assuming it's been there that long. Interestingly, comets are some of the fastest objects in the solar system relative to Earth. It's largely because many of them orbit the sun in the opposite direction of Earth. Is what we call retrograde orbit. Relative to Earth, Halley's Comet is going about 70 kilometers a second, or about 160,000 miles an hour.
That's even hard to imagine.
It's an insane speed. It's more than 3 times the speed of the dinosaur-ending Chicxulub impactor. And the Chicxulub impactor was probably an asteroid, given its large amount of iridium. So I should probably just start calling it the Chicxulub asteroid. That's what some people call it. Halley's Comet is about 9 by 5 miles or 15 by 8 kilometers, which is in the same ballpark as the Chicxulub impactor. But the Chicxulub impactor was dense rock. And since comets have a lot of ice, they're a lot less dense. So Halley's Comet is probably about a quarter of the density roughly as the Chicxulub impactor, which is in favor of it being less damaging to Earth if it were to collide.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, calculating kinetic energy as mass times velocity squared, so that increased speed of being 3 times as fast has a much bigger effect than that quarter of the mass.
So it doesn't have to be as big because it goes so fast it can do as much damage.
Yeah. So if it did hit Earth, it would be really bad. Probably Chicxulub bad, maybe even worse. But fortunately, we can track Halley's Comet and predict the next several orbit, so several hundred years worth, and it is nowhere near hitting Earth. There are a lot of astronomers that I have seen informally say that Halley's Comet basically has no chance of ever hitting Earth, which is nice.
That is nice. One less thing to worry about.
Yeah. Like I said, it's mostly because they're in different planes and it's over by Venus, basically. So yeah, it would have to change quite a bit. JPL did a calculation of the next pass in 2061. And again, it's nowhere near hitting anything. The most recent pass in 1986 was apparently the hardest one to see in recorded history since the comet was on the opposite side of the sun from the Earth. It was basically like the worst possible conditions for viewing Halley's Comet. And it was reportedly so dim that people couldn't even see it without using binoculars. Which is not usually the case. 2061, though, is supposed to be much better with the comet and Earth on the same side of the sun.
Oh, save the date.
Yep. July 28th, 2061 is when it's going to be visible.
Yeah, that'll sneak up on you.
Mark your calendars.
And on that note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. If you want to get links to the articles that we mentioned in this episode, sign up for our newsletter. You can do so at iknowdino.com. And stay tuned for next week's episode where we are interviewing researcher, author, and illustrator Gregory Paul, who is a major influencer in the world of paleontology.
And made a lot of news recently because of the proposal of splitting T-Rex into 3 species.
Thanks for listening, and until next time.